Amen. We're beginning a new series today, having completed a summer series called A Beautiful Beginning. And for those of you who are here for the first time, I'm new as well. I started on June 30th, and the sermon series was a way of exploring different aspects of good beginnings. What makes a good beginning? What are the ingredients of a good beginning? And I had fun exploring those ideas this past summer. I hope you did too. Beginnings are always kind of starting with fits and starts, and you kind of learn how to get rolling, and it takes time. We had to figure out the technology, and I had to figure out the flow of the service, and your culture of being here today, and the ways in which this church has manifested itself in this community. It's been an awesome experience learning this church community. I feel so grateful to be here. We start a new series today called A Beautiful Lord, which is piggybacking on this idea of beauty as one of the graces that God gives to us, that beauty is all around us, and to look at the ways in which the Lord Jesus is beautiful, a beautiful Lord, a beautiful teacher. It doesn't mean that we always agree with what Jesus says or how he comes across in the Gospels or other extra-canonical writings, but we can agree that so much of Jesus' teaching is beautiful and was transformative to humankind. And so I have an aim, a wish, a desire to study the life of Jesus and some of his teachings through the lens of the Gospel of Mark, which is the current appointed lectionary reading for the Presbyterian Church. Actually, many churches have been reading the Gospel of Mark since Pentecost in the church. They go through the whole Gospel of Mark right up until Advent. So we're kind of picking up halfway through. While we were doing another series, a lot of churches were reading Mark. So we're picking up with Mark chapter 7. But I have this wish, this desire, this intuition, like the Jesus we read about in the New Testament isn't the same Jesus that we would experience today if he was back here today, right now in our culture. I really believe that we need to help rehabilitate or represent the gospel teachings and connect them with our lived experience in a way that we would say, this is what Jesus would be saying today. If he said the same thing today, this is how it would come across. This is how he would convey it. Because like what we just heard read from Bob, it's beautiful, but it's hard to connect with. Really, what are you saying here? What's the import for us, for you and for me, about this idea of wearing masks, being hypocrites? So one of my wishes for this sermon series is to do the service of building a bridge from what was written in the Gospels 2,000 years ago to what could be written today. If it were to be rewritten today, what would it say? And I don't certainly have the last word on that. No one really does, but we can use our imagination and creativity and wish for a deeper connection of meaning to what the intent would have been, spiritually speaking, that Jesus was trying to convey. I admit to you that I have problems with Jesus. I've had problems with Jesus for a long time. Not so much that I, have been upset with Jesus per se, or walked away from Jesus, but I have ignored him for a long time. Turned a blind eye, so to speak, to the Gospels and focused on other things. And I think a lot of people are kind of wishy-washy about Jesus. They don't really know what to make of Jesus. And so hopefully in this series we'll explore making a connection that can help us open our hearts again to Jesus in a new way, and our minds as well. So I hope that's intriguing to you. We'll be exploring the Gospels and the lessons in the Gospel of Mark. They're appointed by the lectionary, so I'm not choosing them. The lectionary has appointed them. So we begin today with Mark chapter 7. It's a type of conversation that Jesus has on several occasions throughout the Gospels. It's a type of confrontation that Jesus has with the religious leaders, you could say the senior pastors of the day, of the big mega churches, the powerful mega churches, senior pastors who are making millions and millions of dollars off the gospel. No criticism there. But that's who the Pharisees and Sadducees were. They were the elite, they were the powerful, they were the wealthy. And I always like to remind people, when people talk about that they crucified Jesus, they oftentimes are referring to the Jewish people. I hate it when people do that, because it wasn't the Jewish people that crucified Jesus. It was a small group of leaders, a very small group of powerful, wealthy, religious leaders who were afraid that Jesus was going to undermine their business of the temple. So by a vast amount of the Jewish people were very responsive to Jesus' teaching and his ministry. They were attracted to his healing and his teaching. He was connecting with people in a new way that had never been done before. His message was brand new. It was God repackaged, not anymore with the laws and the rituals of the Jewish tradition that had accumulated over hundreds of years. This was fresh teaching. This was powerful, life-changing teaching. And you can see why people were attracted to it. And to this day, you can see why people want to leave the, ossified churches of liturgy and ritual that are empty and go find experience where they can lift their hands up and have a rock and roll praise band. You can see why people are attracted to that, and why people love Joel Osteen, for example, wonderful pastor in Houston, Texas. They love him because he speaks to their lived experience, and he's repackaging the gospel in new ways. Whatever you make of Joel Osteen and his teaching, he's definitely repackaging it in a new way that really connects with a lot of people. So we can see the dynamic here. Jesus was repackaging Judaism to a wider audience, and he was very attractive. But there were these moments of confrontation. He was never as harsh to someone as he was to someone who was a religious hypocrite, who he called a hypocrite, someone who was saying to be a believer or a teacher of God's truth, but on the inside their heart was hardened and rebellious and mean-spirited to others. And you can see Jesus again and again pointing this out to people and calling them down and dressing them down. And so this is a type of conversation that we just heard of Jesus confronting the religious leaders. I'm not going to get into the specifics of the literalness of what he was confronting in terms of this washing hands business. In a certain sense, it doesn't really matter which ritual they were accusing him of breaking. This was a law that was added on by the rabbis hundreds of years after Moses wrote the law. It was called the Mishnah. It was commentary on the Old Testament scriptures. Hundreds and hundreds of laws had been added on to the Old Testament laws. And so the poor Jewish people had all the weight of these minuscule laws to deal with. Did you wash your hands correctly before the meal? Are you ritually impure? Are you a woman who's impure? Don't come around me. All these crazy ritual laws that they put in place to make sure that people were holy and pure. You can see the impulse was good, but it added a ton of weight to people's spiritual journeys to make sure, are they really doing all the laws? How could anyone fulfill all the laws? So when Jesus came along and said, the best law, the greatest law, the only law that matters is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, and soul, and to love your neighbor as yourself. People were like, huh? I don't have to wash my hands 7 times a day? Upside down with the fingers and upright, up and down? They were like, let's follow this guy. Jesus boiled down all those religious laws to love God and to love one another. You can see why he was so compelling. But the heart of what he's saying, and this is the bridge to our day-to-day living for what we're dealing with, because we don't have ritual purity laws. We really don't, as Protestants, have much of anything like that. If you grew up Roman Catholic, probably the most closest thing you've experienced to that were the rules of Lent, the ritual purity rules of Lent. And some people were indoctrinated with that pretty intensely. You could only eat fish on Fridays, and that's pretty intense. And I don't know Roman Catholicism that well, but I do know that there are a lot more ritual purity laws in that religious expression than in the Protestant community. But the point is that the heart of the matter here is so important for each of us. What Jesus is really getting at is what we would today call the psychological insight of our true self. Has anyone heard of that word, true self? How about false self? Anyone heard of the word false self? Not everyone in the room has heard it, but you have a false self. We all have a false self. We may never have heard of it. Thomas Merton, famous Roman Catholic monk of the mid-20th century, he died in 1968, too soon, accidentally electrocuted. But he was a profound teacher of the contemplative dimension of Christianity. He was reintroducing the inner life in the midst of a big external church. So he wrote about the psychological dimension of spiritual life. And he drew from different psychologists, but as far as I know, he was the first Christian writer, certainly in modern times and probably ever, to talk about the false self. And most people talk about sin as what's wrong with human beings. But Thomas Merton began to say, what's really wrong with us as human beings is that we're wounded in childhood and that we develop this crust over us like a skin. It's a psychological skin, or in Jesus' terms, it's a psychological mask. And that mask is our false self. I particularly have come to not prefer the word false self versus true self, because the negative connotation of the word false and also the dualism implicit in false and true, like true is better than false. But the reality is that it's more of our surface self than a false self. Some people talk about it as our social self. But the truth is that we have many different versions of ourself that we present to the world and to one another. We have our church self. Then we have our drinking at the bar self. Then we have our yelling at our kids self. Then we have our married in conflict self. We have our at work self. We show one side of ourself to our colleagues and our boss. They have no idea about this other side of us. So this is very practical. We all have a social self or a surface self that we reveal to the world and share with other people. In a certain sense, that's what he means by false self. When Jesus says, "You are hypocrites," the Greek word hypocrite literally means under a mask. Judging under a mask is actually the literal translation. Hypocrites were actually referred to as actors. They wore a hypostasis, a mask. Their self was under a mask. So an actor in Greek culture would put on different masks to play different characters. A man could become a woman under a mask. The protagonist could become the hero under a mask. You could change who you were presenting to the world by putting on a mask. So hypocrites were people who were wearing a mask of niceness on the outside, but underneath were crisis, were judging other people the whole time. And these rabbis and these Sadducees and these Pharisees were looking at Jesus' disciples, judging them. On the outside, they were religious, wearing their senior pastor gown, but on the inside, they were hateful and judging Jesus because he had a crowd and they didn't, and because his disciples didn't wash their hands like they were supposed to. On the outside, senior pastor. On the inside, hard-hearted, hating heart, judging, critical, mean. Sound familiar to your experience? Ever feel that way? Ever had a face where you're trying to smile, but inside you're wanting to kill the person? I love that line, Have you ever thought of divorce? No? Murder? There's a lot underneath us that we don't show on the surface. The surface self is essential for good culture to continue. If everyone was telling the truth to one another, we would have a problem. So the surface self isn't this negative thing per se. There's nothing evil about the surface self. It's a necessary thing that supports human relationships, but it's not all of us. So the surface self can be happy on the outside, but on the inside you can be grieving because someone just broke up with you. And you can't show that grief or sorrow at work because it wouldn't be the right place to show it, right? Does that make you a hypocrite? No, it makes you experiencing the power of the social self. You need to keep a stiff upper lip in that context. But when you go home and you call your mom or your dad and you cry, that social self drops down, and what comes up? Your true self. Your tender-hearted, open self that's free of the constraint of the social surface self. That's one reason people feel so at ease with their beloveds, is because they can drop the drama of the performance of who they think they're supposed to be, and they can actually be themselves for the first time. And that's love, to be yourself with another and be accepted for who you are. And not have them change you, so you have to get a different mask on to play the part for them, so that they feel better because you're more like they want you to be. So all of us are playing these roles. You could begin to see the connection here, that Jesus is acknowledging, look, people of the human race, when it comes to spirituality, there's this reality that's deeper than the surface social self. There's also this thing called, you could put it this way, even though it's fairly significant, word, the shattered self. Some people talk about it as the fragmented self. But if you ever looked at a mirror that's broken, you can kind of see you're a multiplicity in the mirror. Shatter a mirror, and you appear in all sorts of different little minuscule reflections. There are people we know in this culture, in this world, who get so shattered by life through abuse or neglect or hatred or systemic racism or injustice or war, that their psyche literally shatters into pieces. Maybe not 1,000, but maybe 3. Just enough so that a part of them doesn't integrate into themselves and is deeply in need of integration. And most of the people in our prisons who are violent offenders were children at one point who were abused violently, verbally, or didn't have 2 parents in their home and experienced a shattering. And they act out from that shattering. They don't even know why they're acting out, but they're acting out with violence and meanness. And we think they're criminals, they need to be locked up, they're evil people, they're terrorists. Well, their surface self, their fragmented self, yes, they're acting out. But underneath there's something more to them than their shatteredness. Just like there's more to us than our social self and our shatteredness. So love begins to see through people's social self and their shattered self to their deepest real self, their true self that's created in the image of God, that never changes. Their unique thumbprint of their soul that came into this universe from God, that makes them worthy and truly lovable, even though on the outside it's hard to love them. So Jesus is hinting at all these realities. He doesn't use this language, but now in the modern times we understand the depth of psychology and its insights. And there's one other dimension that we need to confront, and that's really real for all of us. We move from the social self or the surface self. We move through the shattered self and its healing and an integration process. Good therapy, love, healing can happen. But there's also a dynamic that we have to recognize that's operative in most human beings, whether they know it or not. Carl Jung brought this to our attention, so did Sigmund Freud, but they call it the shadow self or the unconscious. And the word unconscious was not present in people's awareness during Jesus' day. They understood sin as being offending God by not doing the holy ritual laws. But what's really wrong with human beings isn't per se sin. Sin is just you might say, the byproduct of what's really going on. We sin, we miss the mark of what it means to be human because of this shadow stuff that's deep in us at the unconscious level. Just a simple example, and it's a very trite example, but when I was the infant, my mother basically was alone a lot. And we lived in people's homes that they let us live in. My father was an itinerant singer. And so early on in my childhood, in infancy, I must have picked up on my mother's sense of insecurity of, are we going to even have a meal tomorrow? Or where are we going to live? Or where is my husband? I must have picked up on that insecurity. Because deep in my shadow self, deep in my unconscious, for a long, long time I had to wake up to this and go to therapy and do different things to discover the dynamic of why I was looking for something that would make me feel secure and strong. And I would project that on other people. I would latch on to people who I thought were strong. Well, little did I know, I had made an idol out of that because of my deep, shattered shadow self that I acquired by no fault of my own, just by being human. So multiply that times 8 billion. All of us, of no fault of our own, growing up, acquire a shattered self. And from that place of shatteredness or shadow of unconsciousness, we live our lives and act it out. So the Greeks were right. The first step to freedom is to know thyself. And Jesus then invites us to surrender thyself to a power greater than ourselves, to Him. And that's the Christian invitation. And healing comes by way of seeing. The more we observe about ourselves and discover the shadowedness, the shatteredness, the more we see, the more we get freed. Seeing is freeing. This is a beautiful gift. You don't have to do anything else but see it sometimes to know that you're not it. It's just something running on your system like a bad virus or program running on a computer. I'm running out of time, but I wanted to illustrate this in some very powerful ways through literature. And in the next several weeks, I'm going to try and bring literature in as illustrations of these insights that Jesus is trying to say. The falseness that which we live under, the fear in which we live under, we are being invited to let that go and be healed, to discover our true real self, our deepest self, our centered self in God, healed of our fragmentation, healed of our multiplicity, healed of our lack of integrity, healed of doing this with some people and doing that with other people, of saying this one day, of disagreeing with that another day. We can see the dynamic in our lives. We need centeredness, which comes from wholeness, H-O-L-E, whole, not H-O-L-Y, holy. That's really what's at heart here. Jesus really could care less about holiness. What Jesus wants is wholeness, coherence in our lives, integration, spiritually, psychologically, physically. Love the Lord your God with all your mind, with all your emotions, with all your body and your strength. Integration. How do we do that? It takes a lifetime. Here are 2 stories, and I'm not going to read all of this. But the first story is a scene from Les Mis. Perhaps you've seen this movie or loved the show. Victor Hugo's Les Mis. It's one of the best illustrations of a person seeing through the shattered, fragmented social self. Jean Valjean was a terrible criminal. He had been broken by life. He was unjustly treated, terribly treated as a child growing up. But he had become hard-hearted because of all that violence to him. The bishop takes him in. Jean Valjean takes the gold and silver things from the bishop's house and leaves, stealing a ton of money. He gets caught by the police. The police don't believe him. He tells the police that they're his. The bishop gave them to him. Please bring him back to the bishop. And they say, we found this man, he says you gave it to him. And the bishop says, yes, and you forgot to take the candlesticks as well, and these other things. Why didn't you take those? I gave them to you. And he gives the gold candlesticks to Jean Valjean, who stands there dumbfounded. And the police leave, they don't charge him, and this is what happens next. Jean Valjean was trembling in every limb. He took the 2 candlesticks mechanically and with a bewildered air. Now, said the bishop, go in peace. By the way, when you return, my friend, it is not necessary to pass through the garden. You can always enter and depart through the street front door. The bishop drew near to him and said in a low voice, Jean Valjean, my brother, you no longer belong to evil, fragmentation, but to good, wholeness. It is your soul that I heal from you. I withdraw it back from dark thoughts and the spirit of perdition, and I give it to God. It's a beautiful, powerful moment. It changes his life forever. Takes someone seeing deeper than the social fragmented self and reminding him who he really is. Mary of Bethany is a story in the Gospels, Luke chapter 7 and John chapter 12. You can read about it. Mary of Bethany was falsely accused by early church theologians as being a prostitute because she's the one who takes that jar of expensive oil and wipes Jesus' feet with it and covers his hair with it. And they say that she was the prostitute who was healed of 7 demons. And where else could she have gotten this money but the ill-gotten trade of prostitution? And she pours $20,000 worth of perfume on Jesus. She's Mary of Bethany, Lazarus' sister. She's the one who comes out to meet Jesus and just wants to be with Jesus. And Martha is her sister that Jesus says, Martha, Martha, you're worried about so many things. Mary has chosen the better part, just to be with me. She's the first contemplative in the Gospels. But she has this brokenness in her that gets healed and integrated and whole through her love and encounter with Jesus. It's a beautiful story of Mary of Bethany, not Mary Magdalene. And lastly, there's a beautiful story in Fyodor Dostoevsky's The Brother of Karamazov. It's the last scene of the chapter called Cana of Galilee. And if you've never read that, it's worth reading just that chapter, Cana of Galilee. Before I read this, I'll just say Richard Rohr is a modern teacher who integrates spirituality and psychology, and I know he's a fan to a lot of people who are a fan of him. But Richard Rohr said, great love will heal us and awaken us, and great suffering will integrate us and make us whole. Great love and great suffering do this in our lives. In the case of Mary of Bethany, she experienced great love with Jesus. Great suffering wakes us up. If we can endure it, it will wake us up and will heal us. It cracks us open. Some of us need to experience suffering to be cracked open to that healing light. Alyosha is a young man. He's spent some time in a monastery with his spiritual mentor and teacher who has just died. And Alyosha had been spending time in front of the coffin. And this is the scene. Alyosha was a confused, shattered man. He was abused by his family. He was a troubled young man. And his priest mentor helped him find that wholeness and healing. And this is the last scene. He wakes up after a dream beside the coffin of his mentor. And he says, oh, in his rapture he was weeping even over those stars. I'm sorry. Alyosha gazed for half a minute at the coffin. He was listening and expecting other words, but suddenly he turned sharply and went out of the cell. He did not stop on the steps either, but went quickly down, his soul overflowing with rapture. It yearned for freedom, space, openness. The vault of heaven, full of soft, shining stars, stretched vast and fathomless above him. The Milky Way ran in 2 pale streams from the zenith to the horizon. The fresh, motionless, still night enfolded the earth. The white flowers and golden domes of this cathedral gleamed out against the sapphire sky. The gorgeous autumn flowers in the beds round the house were slumbering till morning. The silence of earth seemed to melt into the silence of the heavens. The mystery of earth was one with the mystery of the stars. Alyosha stood, gazed, and suddenly threw himself down on the earth. He did not know why he embraced it. He could not have told why he longed so irresistibly to kiss the earth, to kiss it all. But he kissed it, weeping, sobbing, and watering the earth with his tears. And he vowed passionately to love it forever and ever. Water the earth with the tears of your joy and love those tears. What was he weeping over? Oh, in this rapture, he was weeping even over those stars, which were shining to him from the abyss of space. And he was not ashamed of that ecstasy. There seemed to be threads from all those innumerable worlds of God, linking his soul to them in that moment. And it was trembling all over. In contact with other worlds, he said. He longed to forgive everyone and for everything, and to beg forgiveness. Oh, not for himself, but for all humans, for all and for everything. And others are praying for me too, he echoed in his soul. But with every instant he felt clearly, and as it were tangibly, that something firm and unshakable as the vault of heaven had entered into his soul. It was as though some idea had seized the sovereignty of his mind, and it was for all his life and forever and ever that way. He had fallen on the earth a weak, fragmented boy, but he rose up a resolute whole champion, and he knew and felt it suddenly at the very moment in his ecstasy, and never, never, all his life long, could Alyosha forget that moment. Someone visited my soul in that hour, he used to say, with implicit faith in his words. Within 3 days, he left the monastery in accordance with the words of his mentor, "Go, be whole, and sojourn in the world." It's a beautiful image of a boy falling apart to the ground and rising up a man. We could go on about stories in our lives, about our own transformation of letting go of the social self where we feel so safe and letting it open to other people and to the Spirit and to the beauty of creation to heal us and make us whole, to make us less of hypocrites, to wear our true self mask so that we don't have to put on the faces for other people. We can truly be whole and healed, full of love and light, letting it flow through our lives to bless other people, so that as we go around, people find the courage to be themselves as well. And we're no longer afraid to walk out into the world. We're fearless because we've been touched by something whole and holy. And that's what Jesus is trying to convey. Don't stop at the surface religious practices. There's so much more. And the world has forsaken Christianity to in large part in its churches because of our hypocrisy. What people really want is healing, wholeness, peace that lasts and endures, contact with truths that change their lives forever, not judgment, not being told that they're evil or bad or wrong, but that they are being healed and made whole and holy in the love of God. And that's the message of Jesus. He shows us how. You've heard what I've had to say. Let's take a moment in the silence. What is the Spirit saying to you? Thank you for your listening ears. Lord, in our listening, turn our hearing into a temple of your presence, that we would be free to discover once again who you've made us to be and become. Through Christ our Lord we pray. Amen. Let's stand and give our hearts to song and sing the doxology.